As the musical genre hip-hop itself came into being, so too did the seminal hip-hop artist, Common. In this way, he became one of the few who developed alongside with it. Moreover, his ascension into the annals of its history would pass through what is considered its golden age. The importance of this is especially pronounced in his case, as he wasn't simply another artist in this genre, but instead an integral part of it, as his style embraced lyricism above all, and very much emphasized the roots of the culture, so much that despite his birthplace being nearly 800 miles from where it originated, he was welcomed by and musically melded with its natives. All of this was accomplished without sacrificing his integrity or the integrity of the area he represented. And while his particular brand of music could have relegated him to a loyal cult following, Common's ability to blend well with the right people allowed him to become a universal appeal. In the span of a decade, he would go from underground to commercial success to a leading man, opposite, coincidentally, another of hip-hop's royalty. Hello and welcome, or welcome back, to the Awesome Blackness channel. I am the Mighty One, and on this platform, we celebrate the awesomeness of our people. That's right, whether you're big or small, celebrity or civilian, anywhere in the world, if it's awesome, it's featured here. And for this video, we highlight Common. Born on the 13th of March in 1972, Common is from Chicago, Illinois, and is the son of an educator and former school administrator, Dr. Mahalia Ann Hines, and former basketball player turned youth counselor, Lonnie Rashid Lynn Sr., affectionately known as Pops. At 6'7" and 215 pounds, Lonnie played for the legendary Jean-Baptiste du Sable High, a school that had produced a number of basketball legends: Sweet Charlie Brown, Julian Hammond, Kevin Porter, Maurice Cheeks, and the first black player to sign an NBA contract, Nathaniel Sweetwater Clifton, were among its alumni. Lonnie aspired to be drafted like Sweetwater, and his semifinals city championship win against Crane Tech in 1962 proved the catalyst. Crane led 62-61 with 1 second left in a battle that went back and forth. There was cheering and congratulations on one side of the gym and tears on the other. It was DuSable's ball out of bounds beneath the Crane Tech basket, and Lonnie stepped forward. Earlier in the season, he took an out-of-bounds ball and threw an errant pass that was picked off by the opposition. As a result, his coach told him to never take the ball out again. But with 1 second remaining and his team captain screaming, "Give me the ball!" Lonnie disobeyed. Looking up, he saw his teammate, Willie Williams, streaking down the court. He loaded up and let the ball fly. It soared in a perfect arch into Williams' hands, and he made the layup. DuSable won the game. Lonnie would be courted by the University of Kentucky, where he'd be the first African American to play there, but he took himself out of the running.
"I didn't have those Jackie Robinson qualities,"
he explains.
"It was clear that the only integration would have been on the basketball court. Time had pushed them into inviting a black. It wasn't because they wanted to do it. The first brother was going to have to be perfect, and that wasn't me."
He ended up playing for Wilberforce University in Xenia, Ohio. Wilberforce was one of the first black colleges in the United States, but there wasn't much publicity for its basketball program, and its players weren't expected to make the pros. At Wilberforce, Lonnie had met a petite woman by the name of Ann Brown. They were smitten with one another, and they would eventually get together. Lonnie, by the fact that she was so smart and she had made the dean's list every semester. Ann's goal was to become a teacher back in her hometown of Chicago. She would go on to get her doctorate and become a principal and the first in the city of Chicago to put public school kids in uniforms so they would stop killing each other over gym shoes or sports jackets. In total, she invested 14 years into her profession as a CPS teacher and another 17 years in administration. But, for a time, she put her career aspirations on hold, while Lonnie pursued his dream. He was drafted by the St. Louis Hawks in the 12th round of the 1966 NBA draft, just 2 years before they would pick up and move to their present home in Atlanta, but only played for one season. He would spend the next few years being traded to various teams of the American Basketball Association, or the ABA. However, by 1970, he was out of the league. He understandably took it hard.
Suddenly, I was being told I wasn't good enough for something I had always been good enough at.
He returned to Chicago, where Ann secured a job teaching. They would reside in the Calumet Heights neighborhood, during which time was in the midst of experiencing a sea change in its population. The last bastion of the Great Migration, which brought Southern blacks to northern, Midwestern, and Western states, caused the African American population in that particular South Side neighborhood to go from 0 to nearly 45% between 1960 to 1970. Conversely, whites, who were the majority, decreased dramatically then and in the decades to come. White flight, where there is a sudden or gradual large-scale exodus of white people from areas becoming more racially or ethnoculturally diverse, was the antithetical response to the Great Migration. And while the intent could have indeed been as benign as the desire to pivot away from the cramped urban areas many of the major cities like Chicago developed around, in exchange for the more spacious suburban areas that began to spring up post-World War II, the more common motivation was of racial animus. Regardless, the unfortunate side effect of this flight comes with the reduction of area resources that were once available. This reduction breeds contempt and disillusion, which in turn manifest in a lot of malignant ways. Crime and blight were the notable signs of white flight, as was the case of Calumet Heights. Moreover, despite African Americans escaping the harsh oppression of the South, the deep-seated trauma that came along with them, not to mention essentially more of the same in this so-called promised land, leaked into all parts of their life. This discord meant that also ordinarily with a number of broken homes. Devastated by the perceived systemic injustices from his basketball career that was cut short and the inability to get a job, in part because of it, Lonnie turned to drugs to comfort his pain. Ann chose not to notice, or at least never said much. And in 1972, Lonnie Rashid Jr. was born. But Lonnie Sr. wasn't ready.
I was raised without a father. And from what I seen of him when he was drinking, I figured it would have been worse if he stayed around. I decided it would be better for everyone if I wasn't around. You don't mess up 3 people's lives or whack out your kids with your bad habits.
Thus, Lonnie Sr. left. Not as simple as that. And there was even the prospect for he and Ann to reunite, but that never materialized. So when the divorce was finalized, Lonnie would eventually move to Colorado. This left a then 6-year-old Common to be raised by his mother, though his father remained active in his life and was even able to get him a job with the Chicago Bulls as a teenager through his contacts. Undoubtedly, Lonnie had aspirations for his son to follow in his athletic footsteps and perhaps play alongside Michael Jordan one day. Common becoming what Lonnie Sr. should have been would have been the greatest vindication. However, his son had been fostering another passion. Coming into the knowledge of hip-hop at around the age of 10 years old, Common wrote his first verse at 12. By the time the rap duo Eric B. and Rakim dropped their debut album, Paid in Full, during the summer of 1987, he knew he wanted to pursue rap as a career. After all, there was a deep well from which to draw inspiration, and he had the makings of a compelling way to convey it. His own South Side neighborhood and the historic moments it experienced served as a backdrop. Absorbing his well-educated mother's vernacular afforded him a higher vocabulary, and his well-traveled, street-savvy father provided the requisite edge he needed to be taken seriously. Thus, while in high school, Common formed a group called CDR with childhood friends Corey Crawley and Ernest Dion Wilson, commonly known as record producer No ID. Anthony Christopher Kahn, aka Why Not, among other aliases, also served as DJ. The group opened for well-known acts such as Big Daddy Kane and NWA, a group which contained, among others, Ice Cube. CDR was put on hold and eventually dissolved when Common headed off to Florida A&M University on a scholarship to study business administration. This move obviously based off of Mahalia's expectation, which was for her son to take his education seriously and get a degree. However, while in school, Common kept plugging away and never stopped developing his skills. The young MC began to make a name for himself on the campus, dominating late-night ciphers in the common area of the dormitory, among other things. Which is why sophomore year would be a major turning point for Common. After being featured in the unsigned hype column of The Source magazine, which is equivalent to being on the front page of YouTube, he was quickly signed to a recording contract by Relativity Records, an indie label who had just received a 50% stake buy-in by Sony the year prior. From September of 1991 to July of the next year, he would travel to various studios in New York City to record his debut. When the tracks were ready, executives got to work pushing out singles, which gave Common a strong underground reputation prior to the album's release. Take It Easy, Soul by the Pound, and Breaker 19 reached number 5, 7, and 10, respectively, on the Billboard Hot Rap Singles chart, which bolstered his grassroots notoriety. It had become apparent at this point that school couldn't continue to be a viable option when superstardom seemed to be on the horizon, though his mother rightfully had her reservations. She states in a June 27, 2005 Jet magazine interview the following.
When he decided to leave FAMU to pursue rap, we had a good talk about it. I was extremely upset. I didn't know what rap was. We agreed that if he did not do well in 3 years, he would go back to school.
Released on the 6th of October in 1992, Can I Borrow $1 was met with lukewarm critical reception, with the very magazine responsible for launching the MC's career giving it a 3.5 out of 5 mics. The Source lauded the tracks, which were majorly produced by No ID, going by Immense Slope, and Why Not, going by The Twilight Tone, with the Beatnuts contributing 4 tracks, but also noting that lyrically, Common was all over the place. Day Ones will recall his earlier style of rapping, featuring a higher registered, sing-songy and inflection-heavy vocal delivery of lyrics packed with wordplay and references to popular culture, which held reverence to the East Coast and showed signs of what would fully be developed as a signature Midwest style in the coming years, but at this point was wildly undefined. And while the critics were generous with their evaluation of the album, with tracks even garnering significant airplay on BET and MTV, this didn't necessarily translate to abundant sales or a favorable chart position, peaking at number 70 on the top R&B hip-hop albums and reportedly only selling 2,000 copies, though records indicate that it ultimately sold 131,000 units. This was obviously disheartening, with Common admitting in later years that he had considered quitting rap at that point and fulfilling the agreement he made with his mother. It is a good thing that he didn't. To that end, his label, that would have ordinarily dropped an artist based on such a performance, hadn't given up on him either, commissioning a follow-up soon after. Recording for the MC's sophomore album took place between the summer of 1993 through the spring of 1994. This time, he made a more concerted effort. First was the adoption of a new rhyming style, which he admits was heavily influenced by the album Illmatic. This debut from Queens rapper Nas is considered one of the greatest albums of all time, receiving universal acclaim upon its release. This work was being recorded around the same time and in the same studio they'd both frequent, so surely Common was privy to, and thus inspired by, its potential. Accordingly, the MC's album had an overall more cohesive theme. It was divided into two sections, the east side of Stony and the west side of Stony, Stony Island Avenue being a street that runs through his neighborhood. Interlaced throughout the album were short interludes that form a loose narrative concerning day-to-day life on the south side. The closing track, Pop's Rap, was the first in a series featuring spoken word and poetry by Lonnie Sr., who was used to close out several of his son's albums. Production was still undertaken by No ID and Why Not, and maintained the minimalistic jazzy motif as Can I Borrow $1? Resurrection, released nearly 2 years to the date as his last effort, and a year shy of his promise to return to school, was a metaphorical rebirth for the MC, as he considered his career to be dead after Can I Borrow $1? One of the singles, the eponymous Resurrection, was lyrically weighty and required several re-listens to catch all of the metaphors and allegories. The album achieved a much larger degree of critical acclaim, which extended beyond the Chicago music scene. In the source, Chairman Mao stated that Common presents a thinking man's perspective on rhyming that's admirably down to earth and free of gimmicks. Again, it would receive 3.5 out of 5 mics. Other favorable reviews include a 9.5 out of 10 in Rap Reviews, a 4 out of 5 in Rolling Stone, and a 3.5 out of 4 in the Chicago Tribune, indicating the love he received at home and more broadly. Although initially selling 2,000 copies, the album sold relatively well, ultimately pushing 231,000 units, and received a strong positive reaction among alternative and underground hip-hop fans at the time. Furthermore, it peaked at a respectable number 27 on the Billboard Hot Rap Singles chart. This album would also come with slight controversy. I Used to Love Her, Resurrection's lead single, ignited a feud with West Coast rap group Westside Connection, headed by former NWA member Ice Cube. The lyrics of the song criticized the path hip-hop music was taking, utilizing a metaphor of a woman to convey the genre, and were interpreted by some as directing blame towards the popularity of West Coast gangsta rap. As mentioned, hip-hop is a cultural expression that is conveyed primarily through music. Formed during the 1970s in New York City, African American youth and young immigrants and children of immigrants from countries in the Caribbean, for example, used this as a multicultural exchange between one another, common ground upon which they all stood. From there, its influence would spread across the nation. reaching all corners of the country in no time. By the 1980s, it had fully immersed itself into the lands and diaspora, affecting melanated youths in just about every urban and rural area, where, much like regional accents that sprout from the same language, hip-hop took on unique forms of rhythm and style specific to its locale. And while places like the South and Midwest would take more time in establishing itself, by then, the West Coast was undoubtedly considered as yet another hotbed of the culture, developing a signature style that was synonymous with its laid-back atmosphere and attitude. Additionally, there were subcultures within hip-hop an artist could easily fit into one or more of. Aside from the designations underground, conscious, progressive, or even political, Common was undoubtedly considered an alternative hip-hop artist, which AllMusic defined as a style of hip-hop that refused to conform to any traditional styles of rap such as gangsta, bass, hardcore, and party rap, but instead blurred genres, drawing equally from funk and pop, rock, as well as jazz, soul, reggae, and even folk. Alternative rap tended to be embraced largely by the alternative rock listeners and indie music fans, rather than the hip-hop or pop audiences, and thus, it wasn't considered mainstream. Such artists received limited exposure through commercial radio and other media outlets, and primarily relied upon campus radio and various independent media channels. To this day, alternative hip-hop is the paradoxical recipient of consistent critical acclaim, but is generally shunned by American mainstream media and widely regarded as commercially unappealing. The messaging was antithetical to the debaucherous, excessive, and oftentimes violent lifestyle perpetuated by other genres, i.e. gangsta, instead being socially aware, uplifting, and sometimes, albeit unintentionally, sanctimonious. And while many people today are waking up to the destructive force gangster rap truly is to the community, and is responsible in great part to the birth of the fatherless children that is trap, drill, and the truly exceptional mumble rap, it was, and unfortunately continues to be, the more mainstream genre, thanks to the old adage that sex and violence sells. This domination caused artists like Common to speak on these issues, to which Cube took exception. In particular, the line,
"Now black music is black music and it's all good. I wasn't salty, she was with the boys in the hood,"
alluded to the film Boys in the Hood, set in South Central Los Angeles, a movie starring the West Coast rapper.
Yes, yes, y'all. You don't stop.
This caused the MC and his group to release the song West Side Slaughterhouse. Throughout this song, and even the group's album, Bow Down, they threw jabs at Common, amongst other rappers from the East Coast. And, in a greater offense to the latter, going so far as to proclaim that hip-hop actually originated there.
And I heard it, and at first I was like, man, I'm gonna let it go. My first thing was like, I'm gonna let it go. You know, he dissed me. I'm thinking like, yo, I grew up listening to Cube. You know, I was happy that he knew who I was, you know, like that he even recognized me. But I was hurt that he had dissed me a little, you know. But overall, I was just like, all right, that's cool. Kind of laughed it off. And then I seen Ice Cube and Mac 10 and WC, they were on BET dissing me. I was like, okay, this is going too far. I'm gonna have to defend myself.
Common, true to his proclamation made in Resurrection that
I'm a hoe but not a again, boy. Ain't scared of no again. When it's my turn to go, I gotta go. And I'm going with the storm.
Replied with the equally venomous The Bitch in You on the 10th of September in 1996.
That's right. I gotta take him off of here. There was only one, and that's me. You understand? For all that fighting, you understand? The sucker think he good. The sucker think he can whoop me. And I knew he can't whoop me. Hey, boy, the whole style is chump. You understand? Yeah. When it comes to me,
1, 2.
Yeah. Oh, yo, I need something to do. Yeah. Oh, yo, I need yourself. Ha. Kyle says, yeah. Southside. Yeah. So get outside. Yeah. The busted out shot say a shit nigga with an attitude named Q. Step to the calm with a few. That what the fuck I look like this in the whole coast. You ain't made this dope since America's most wanted to see off the Midwest to the east. On the it's got the east where your first release talk. At least is up at the crib house against get evicted. And videos of white boys talking you get wicked. Natural born killer, even you natural born God. Read rich, got the nerve to say you are. Hypocrite, I'm filling out your death certificate. Swinging beam cards and St. Odds in the same sentence. Shit have repented. On the 16th of October, gets a beast besides George Clinton. So rock over rock, career's over, better off acting. What trouble I see, it matters your WCOY team. You rocked into a whole corner hustler. Line on your get, said you was go-getter. Use higher learning. I'll take my words out of chats. Went from gangsta to Islam to the Gilgadas effects. It'll take the nation, the millions to hold you back from getting you mouth shots or hit with the wife the route got. But sucker ain't round, it's your Friday, it was good. I went and saw you, she was with the boys in the hood. I see the dip city. When you don't speak your mind, the dip city. Look at me in my eyes, Ryan. I see the dip city. To be hard, you try. And while this is what it normally took for a beef on wax to escalate to full-on violence, considering this occurred in and around the time of the murders of both West Coast rapper Tupac Shakur and East Coast native, the notorious B.I.G., which, to a greater extent, would have continued to perpetuate the animus between the two coasts. The rivalry would be settled out of public view at a peacemaking function held by notable Chicago figure and minister for the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, at his home. And this goodwill would be further solidified in later years. Initially scheduled for an October 1996 release, One Day It'll All Make Sense dropped the next year in September, taking a total of 2 years to complete, for reasons explained, and included collaborations with artists such as Lauryn Hill, Erykah Badu, De La Soul, Q-Tip, Cannabis, Black Thought, Shantae Savage, and Questlove, a future fellow member of the Soulquarians outfit. The Soulquarians were a rotating collective of predominantly East Coast artists who collaborated on one another's projects. Stylistically, they produced neo-soul, alternative hip-hop, progressive soul, avant-garde, conscious rap, and jazz fusion, holding extensive and innovative sessions at Electric Lady Studios in New York, and produced several well-received albums. Questlove of the hip-hop band The Roots acted as the musical powerhouse behind several of the collective's projects from artists, including their 1999 album Things Fall Apart, soul singer D'Angelo's Voodoo, neo-soul artist Erykah Badu's Mama's Gun, and Common's 2 subsequent albums after One Day. Apropos, this album was another solid effort for the MC, making a point of eschewing any gangsterism in response to questions about his musical integrity, and was critically acclaimed for its consistency, yet growth lyrically, the latter perhaps due to personal growth the MC had undertaken.
Let's talk about respecting that even when there's disagreement, because you did a very controversial song with Lauryn Hill.
Yeah.
And in it, you and she, in the song, discuss an abortion.
Abortion, yeah.
And you have the line, $315 ain't worth your soul.
Yeah.
You say, knowing you're the best part of life, do I have the right to take yours?
Yeah.
What was that song about? What does that mean to you?
That song was very personal because at that point in my life, I was me and my partner had an abortion, and it was heavy. And for me to experience that, I felt that I needed to be more responsible in my actions prior to pregnancy. And that's really what the gist of that song eventually became, and was saying how much respect I do have for life, and I don't want to put myself or anyone else in that situation anymore.
During recording, Common found out that he and his fiancée, Kim Jones, were expecting a child. Thus, he placed things on hold before eventually going back to finish the album. Omoyé Asaralen was born shortly after the album's release. The birth was obviously a joyous occasion, but it came with complications. Chiefly, that this was on the precipice of what he believed to be punching through to the next level of his career. It was because of this, and a whole host of other reasons, Common would not stay with the mother of their child long after she was born. That said, what insight into the pause in the project undoubtedly comes from the song Retrospect for Life, the first single from One Day, where Common pointed out that he and Kim almost opted for an abortion because they were not ready to start a family, but chose to give it a go instead. The song featured Lauryn Hill, who herself was pregnant during this time, and is one of the most unforgettable tracks on the album. Nevertheless, much like Lonnie Sr., Common made a concerted effort to be in Omoyé's life. Reminding Me of Seth, a dedication to his friend who tragically was murdered, is the second single and was my entry point into Common. I was just going into my junior year of high school, well into what would inevitably be my I want to be a rapper phase, and Common served as the main inspiration, as this was the first time I had someone as close to me in proximity and aspired style to which I could refer, effectively pushing down Busta Rhymes and LL Cool J on the roster. And in another game of 6 Degrees of Separation, during the making of my video on Tabitha Brown, I was listening to instrumentals, being inspired on where they would be placed, thinking about which ones would be in the video, when I came across Remind Me by Patrice Rushen. Just listening to it reminded me of Common's single, and lo and behold, I soon discovered that this was the song that was sampled, a connection I hadn't made until just recently. I knew from there that I had to do a video on my hip-hop hero, as it was a matter of time. This album also came with another notable change. Back in the day, the MC actually went by the stage name Common Sense because he wanted something that was everyday but still unique. He'd also often joke in interviews that this was something his mother had tried to instill in him. He was able to use the moniker for several years until the threat of a lawsuit from a West Coast reggae group of the same name forced him to shorten it to simply Common. One day's success was enough for a major record label, MCA, to come courting the MC, invariably making it the final release on Relativity. This transition encouraged Common to also make another major move, picking up from the Windy City in lieu of the Big Apple. Like Water for Chocolate was his fourth studio album, but his first major label debut, released on the 28th of March in 2000. Notably absent was the production of No ID, and instead, among others, James DeWitt Yancey, better known as J Dilla. A native of Detroit, the two Midwest natives were kindred spirits. As eventual members of the Soulquarians, Dilla and Common collaborated on numerous projects together. In fact, they got on so well that when the producer decided to move to the West Coast, he asked Common to come with him as a roommate. That said, Common had a number of industry kinships which transformed into inspired works. One of his noted collaborations was with the group Black Star, composed of the duo and Brooklyn natives Yasin Bey, aka Mos Def, and Talib Kweli Green, from their song Respiration on their eponymously titled 1998 album. The Chicago native seemingly and effortlessly matched the energies of the New York duo, further solidifying his credibility in the East Coast and the underground scene. However,